Hello, I'm Matthew Jarron, Museum Curator at the University of Dundee, and welcome to the latest in a series of short films in which I talk about some of the highlights of the University Museum collections. And today I want to talk about a really important donation that we received in the 1950s, which really helped to establish the university's art collection. And it came from a former student called James Nicoll. The university now has one of the largest and most significant art and design collections in Scotland. The very first artwork we acquired was actually at the opening ceremony of University College Dundee in October 1883, when the portrait of our founder, Mary Ann Baxter, was presented to us. But there were only a handful of artworks acquired over the next 6 decades, until 1950, when, somewhat out of the blue, Dr. James Nicoll began a correspondence with Principal Wimberley about his art collection, eventually saying, "My feeling is that the collection of pictures should, after my lifetime, pass into the care of a responsible body, such as my old college in Dundee." So who was Nicoll, and what was his collection of pictures? Well, sadly, we don't have a picture of him, so I can't show you what he looked like, but he was born in 1872 and grew up in Perthshire. He came to University College Dundee in 1891 to study for a medical degree. At that time, Dundee had just begun establishing chairs in biology, anatomy and physiology, and had started to tie up with Dundee Royal Infirmary to offer clinical study, but hadn't yet teamed up with the University of St Andrews to offer degrees in medicine. So after 2 years in Dundee, Nicoll moved to Edinburgh University and completed his MBCM degree in 1897. He went on to take further qualifications as Doctor of Medicine and Doctor of Public Health. By that time he had moved to London, and around 1900 he was appointed as Assistant Medical Officer of the Metropolitan Asylum in Caterham. Working his way up to Senior Medical Officer, he later became Medical Superintendent of Fountain Mental Hospital in Tooting, where he remained for much of his career, eventually having responsibility for the whole of London County Council's Mental Hospital Department. He had a particular interest in the training of mental nurses, and according to the British Medical Journal, he was a pioneer in this field and was one of the men whose efforts laid the foundations for the improvement in their position, which was so marked in the early decades of this century. Nicoll retired in 1930 and was able to devote more of his time to his favourite hobby, collecting pictures. He'd been buying works from Christie's and other London sale rooms throughout the 1920s and amassed a considerable collection. Most of his purchases were Victorian, but they also included some notable earlier works, starting with this fine portrait of Miss Walpole by Peter Lely from around 1669. Here's another portrait of Lady Gooch by John Theodore Hines from 1741, and a lovely little Gainsborough drawing from a decade or two later. Early 19th century works include an equally small oil sketch by Constable and a beautiful set of pastel portraits by John Linnell. Most of these are unidentified, but they include one of the celebrated mathematician Charles Babbage, and a childhood sketch of Charles Collins, the future PreRaphaelite painter and son-in-law of Charles Dickens. The PreRaphaelites were a particular favourite of Nicoll's, and as they were somewhat out of fashion at the time, he was able to acquire some really beautiful pieces quite cheaply. This delicate Rossetti drawing, for example, cost just 3 guineas, while this stunning pastel work by Frederick Sands, the White Maid of Avenel, cost 5 guineas. In fact, most of Nicoll's purchases cost him just a few quid each. By far his most expensive purchase was also his largest, William Etty's epic The Wise and Foolish Virgins, bought in 1924 for 20 guineas, though even that was a considerable bargain. It had cost nearly 8 times that much when it was first sold in 1859. Unusually, Nicoll was also interested in the work of cartoonists and illustrators. He acquired some beautiful examples, including one of Arthur Rackham's original colour illustrations for Wagner's Ring Cycle from 1910, called Rhine Maiden Lamenting. He owned several original Punch cartoons. Here's one of Gladstone by John Tenniel, and of Lloyd George by Bernard Partridge. And this 2-part piece by the French cartoonist Caran d'Ache, called Ancient and Modern Warfare, is a nice precursor of our current collection of original comics art. Landscape paintings were another favourite, with scenes from around the world, including Dartmoor by Leopold Rivers, a French chateau by Alfred East, a street in Cairo by John Varley Jr., and a Middle Eastern scene in what is now Qunawat in Syria by David Roberts. It's no surprise that Scottish landscapes were particularly popular, and he was often willing to pay more than his usual to acquire them. 13 guineas in this case. This is Wolf's Crag by John Thompson of Duddingston, imagining the setting of Walter Scott's The Bride of Lammermoor based on Fast Castle in Berwickshire. Other scenes include Tarbert Castle at Loch Fyne by Thomas Miles Richardson, and an unspecified Highland Loch by John McWhirter. Other subjects by Scottish artists include Jews at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem by David Wilkie, one of the artist's final paintings, which was left unfinished when he died. And one of John Phillips' evocative Spanish scenes, this one called The Orange Cellar. Although he mostly acquired work by British artists, Nicoll did purchase a few pieces by continental painters. These peonies by the French painter Madeleine Lemaire, for example, a drawing by Henri Le Sidonnet, and this street urchin, The Girl with Polenta, by the Austrian Cecil van Hanen. Nicoll was obsessive about recording the provenance of his collection and spent some time researching the history of his favourite pieces. As a result, we know about some of the interesting former owners that our artworks have had. This much-loved Edwin Landseer painting, called The Trickster, formerly belonged to Henry Eaton MP, otherwise known as Baron Chalesmore, who was a keen collector of Landseer and also owned his most famous painting, The Monarch of the Glen. This detailed watercolour of the inside of the Church of San Clemente in Rome by Thomas Hartley Cromek was previously owned by Colonel Frank Rhodes, a veteran of the Sudan campaign and the Boer War, and the brother of controversial imperialist Cecil Rhodes. And this lovely drawing by William Quiller Orchardson, called The Return from Market, once belonged to the famous chemist James Dewar of vacuum flask fame, who was a personal friend of the artist. Sometimes, however, Nicoll's works of art have turned out to be not what he thought they were. This portrait of John Glover was bought by him as the work of the English painter Joseph Highmore, but has now been recognised as the work by the Scottish-American painter John Smibert, which makes it much more interesting. Likewise, this Pre-Raphaelite painting, Pleasant Dreams, was thought to be a portrait of Frederick Sands's sister, Emma, but it's actually a painting by her, making it one of the few Pre-Raphaelite paintings by a woman artist in a public collection. Another successful female painter, Charlotte Naismith, painted this scene in 1845, one of only 4 oils by her in public ownership in the UK. It shows the ruins of Kincardine Castle in Perthshire and was one of Nicoll's final purchases in 1946. The subject may have started him thinking more about his former home, and it was soon after that he made contact with University College Dundee. The result was that in 1951 he gifted his entire collection of some 300 artworks to us, along with a large collection of books. At that time, however, the college was considerably smaller than the university is now, and it soon became embarrassingly obvious that there simply wasn't the space to display and store all of these works. What's more, Nicoll's wife was less than happy about his decision to give away his collection, which she was clearly expecting to inherit after his death. Nicoll died in 1958, and after some negotiation, a large part of the collection was returned to his widow, who promptly sold it all at Sotheby's a few years later. The list of what we might have kept makes frustrating reading. We gave back a Turner, for example, and if we had been able to keep everything, we would probably now have the finest Pre-Raphaelite collection in Scotland. These are 2 of the pieces we gave back. But the 84 works that we do still have include, as hopefully you've already seen, some very significant pieces. When the Tower building opened in 1961, many of them were displayed in the new Lamb Gallery that was created on the first floor. This is the Queen Mother performing the opening ceremony, and you can see some of the pictures in the background here. Following Nicoll's generous gift, the university's art and design collections expanded exponentially, and today we have over 8,000 works, displayed in almost every building on our 3 campuses. They are used for teaching and research, and by making the university a more attractive and culturally stimulating environment, they help to develop inspiration and well-being in our students and staff. Well, that's all I have time for today. I hope you found that interesting, and join me for another film coming soon. Bye for now.